There was more to Hank Snow than just country music. His voice cut across generations. He was born in Nova Scotia and overcame extreme poverty and abuse to become one of the Grand Ole Opry's biggest stars. He made his mark on the very fabric of country music, with his signature smooth tenor and hits like I'm Moving On and I've Been Everywhere. He was seen by fans as the clean-cut singing ranger who embodied class and tradition, the kind of performer Nashville wanted the world to see. But beneath that smooth exterior was a man with childhood scars and resentment from a job that made him face realities the public never saw. Hank Snow experienced Nashville's glamour, but he also saw the darkness it attempted to conceal. And he finally talked about the dark side of the city that helped him grow, broke down countless others, and exposed a reality far darker than anyone wanted to think when he was 85 years old. Just before he passed away, Nashville appeared to the outside world to be a utopia. Dreams were supposed to come true in Music City, USA, the glittering capital of country music. Neon lights flashed along its streets. Steel guitars and violins reverberated throughout its stages. Additionally, its record labels pledged to make singers from small towns famous. Legends were created and careers were made overnight at the Grand Ole Opry, which served as a country music cathedral. Nashville appeared to fans both domestically and internationally as a utopia, a mystical setting where skill was rewarded, and each cowboy hat held a tale of achievement. However, as Hank Snow later disclosed, this glitzy exterior was meticulously constructed, and beneath it was a sector that prospered on sacrifice, control, and manipulation, rather than on dreams. Nashville, Hank clarified, was never about justice. It had to do with power. The young, desperate artists who entered the city thought their skill would be enough to get them by. However, the city had its own regulations. Ruthless managers, strong record executives, and backroom deals enforced rules that were never codified. Hank recalled witnessing excited vocalists board buses with their guitars fastened to their backs and hopeful eyes. While some were enticed into contracts that initially appeared to be lucrative but soon turned into prisons, many would never even have the opportunity to perform live. Everything was under the label's control. Royalties, publishing rights, tour dates, and even private lives. Everything was run from the top down. Even after putting their heart and soul into a song, an artist may discover that they no longer owned the words they wrote. They were blacklisted, silently excluded from opportunities, and replaced by the next willing dreamer if they refused. Hank recounted tales of singers who achieved success, but passed away in poverty, as a result of the system draining them of their money. Although Nashville presented itself as a place of opportunity, it was actually founded on the backs of the musicians who made it possible. Hank loved and treasured the Opry, but it wasn't without politics. It wasn't always about skill to get a place on that stage. It mostly depended on who you liked, who you knew, and how much you were prepared to follow the unspoken rules. Backstage, Hank acknowledged, the Opry could feel like a battlefield, where friendships were more important than artistic ability. Despite the fact that it was a hallowed space for fans, people who had doubts about the system were silently dismissed. The world eventually forgot their names as their careers gradually suffocated. Hank was most surprised, however, by how easily the industry hid its tracks. The exploitation, addictions, betrayals, and lives destroyed in the shadows were never visible to the general public. As a family, Nashville sold itself. However, according to Hank, family can be just as harsh and unforgiving as any global corporate empire. As he grew older, Hank Snow's perception of Nashville as the city of dreams changed. According to him, it had turned into a glittering trap that enticed the gullible, with claims of celebrity before consuming them with agreements, politics, and an unquenchable desire for wealth. In his farewell statement, Hank wanted his admirers to know that the Golden City they had come to love had much darker roots than anyone had been prepared to acknowledge. Hank Snow was a young man caught in a world of adversity before he ever stood under the Grand Ole Opry's lights. His early years in Brooklyn, Nova Scotia, a tiny fishing village, were anything but simple. When Hank was still a child, his father left the family, leaving his mother to remarry a man who would turn out to be one of the most sinister characters in Hank's life. Hank's stepfather mistreated him physically and emotionally for years, and the wounds were never fully healed. Later on, he frequently talked about how he felt alienated, even in his own house, and that music was the only thing that made him feel better. The only thing that offered him hope of breaking free from the cycle of pain and poverty that characterized his early years was a battered guitar, which ended up becoming his lifeline. Every chord he strummed conveyed both defiance and desperation. As he learned to play by ear, Hank fled from home as a teenager and started to forge his own path in life. He held a variety of odd jobs, such as cabin boy at sea, where the long nights allowed him to daydream about living a different life. For him, music was more than just a fantasy. It was a matter of survival. He began performing at radio stations, small gatherings, and any other opportunity that came his way, gaining recognition gradually for his distinct tenor voice. But despite his efforts to leave his past behind, the mistreatment and desertion he had experienced influenced his perspective on the world. He was suspicious of authority, he detested injustice, and beneath his courteous smile, he frequently concealed a silent rage. His later perception of the Nashville machine would be influenced by these injuries, because he recognized the same patterns of cruelty and exploitation that had plagued him as a boy. When he eventually made his way into its circle, he knew firsthand what it was like to be helpless from his early years, and he was deeply moved when he witnessed young musicians being dehumanized by influential record executives and managers. Hank was aware that the refined world Nashville presented to its audience was not intended for the impressionable or the weak. You had to put up with betrayal, manipulation, and humiliation in order to survive. Even though he overcame the difficulties in the end, his past made him acutely aware of how easily others could be brought down. Hank Snow's eventual admission of Nashville's darker side wasn't based solely on observation. It came from personal experience. He had fought against oppression all of his life, in his own house at first, and then in the city that sought fragments of his soul in exchange for the promise of the world. The innumerable tales of young men and women who arrived in Nashville with nothing more than a guitar remained in Hank Snow's memory. A heart full of dreams and a few songs. They thought that their voices and talent would be sufficient to lift them out of poverty and into the spotlight. However, Nashville was never intended to honor talent or even moral rectitude. Later in life, Hank disclosed that the city was based on agreements and contracts designed to take advantage of rather than to safeguard. Unaware singers frequently gave up ownership of their own creations for the meaningless prospect of publicity by unknowingly signing away the rights to their songs. Whole catalogs would be taken over by publishing companies, and the artists, who believed they had hit gold, would only end up trapped in one-sided contracts, where executives lived like kings and they saw pennies. Labels for records were no better. Hank remembered how these companies controlled every aspect of a performer's career. Many of the most well-known country music artists, who are adored by fans all over the world, were living under contracts that allowed them absolutely no freedom in anything, from the songs they sang to the way they dressed and spoke. The very machine that claimed to be making them famous could send them on physically taxing tours that ruined their health, make them work long recording schedules that left them exhausted, and keep them in debt all the time. Hank acknowledged that the pressure of these expectations had affected him as well. However, his extensive experience allowed him to see how severely the system hurt the weaker newcomers. Desperation was preyed upon by the machine. While men were taught to remain silent, smile for the cameras, and comply if they wished to remain in the industry, young women were coerced into making compromises in order to obtain opportunities. Artists were viewed as expendable resources. The label would simply move on to the next dreamer waiting outside the office door if one didn't comply. With great sadness, Hank talked about how many careers ended, not because of a lack of talent, but rather because artists were stifled by exploitation before they could do their best work. He knew singers who sold millions of records, but still had trouble making ends meet, because managers and executives embezzled their earnings by purposefully confusing their contracts. It was a system that stole in private and grinned in public. Nashville was heart and soul to its fans. It was a matter of control and ownership for those in charge. The confession from Hank Snow wasn't a sour tirade. It served as a warning. He wanted the world to realize that for every successful artist, dozens more were left broken, forgotten, and impoverished, victims of a field that ate up their enthusiasm and left them with nothing but regret. And by revealing these facts close to the end of his life, Hank was finally revealing what he called one of Nashville's darkest secrets: that the city that was created to celebrate music had also turned into a machine that methodically ate up the musicians themselves. Cowboy boots, guitars, and families huddled around the radio, enjoying the Opry, were the first things that came to mind when people thought of Nashville. However, Hank Snow exposed a shadow world, teeming with vice, corruption, and unbridled power beneath the polished exterior. Those who lived inside the machine saw things that fans could never see. But the leaders of the industry knew how to keep the curtain drawn tight. Hank talked about how opportunities were dominated by pay-to-play politics. Even at the Grand Ole Opry, performances were frequently determined more by personal connections, favors, and backroom deals than by musical ability. Those who rose and those who fell were under the control of promoters, agents, and managers. And before they could even start, those who dared to oppose or speak out against the system were blacklisted. Their phones stopped ringing, their records stopped being promoted, and their careers were crushed. However, politics was only the first step. Hank explained how the city was rife with drug abuse. Under the neon lights, a silent epidemic lurks. Pills were distributed like candy backstage to keep performers awake during demanding schedules or to help them crash after restless nights on the road. And alcohol was freely available at every industry party. Because the system required constant output and limitless energy, some artists resorted to drugs, while others did so out of desperation. Before long, a large number of them were unable to break free from a cycle. According to Hank, executives ignored these problems in private as long as the records sold, and the tours continued to generate revenue, even though they publicly distanced themselves from them. Addictions were viewed as collateral damage in the quest for financial gain, rather than as tragedies. The ability to buy and sell reputations was what most troubled Hank. Instead of using genuine artistry, entire careers could be based on photoshopped images produced in conference rooms. Headlining tours, award nominations, and radio play were all contingent on the unseen strings of strong gatekeepers who demanded silence and allegiance. And Nashville was quick to hide scandals when they broke out, which was inevitable. A mountain of wealth and power buried affairs, betrayals, and even criminal activity. Hank was aware that many well-known country music figures had secrets that would have shocked their fans, and he saw firsthand how the industry worked tirelessly to repair damaged reputations rather than face the truth. All the while, the public continued to believe in the city's wholesome, family-friendly image. He acknowledged that Nashville was more of a kingdom of power, where the people in charge ruled with both charm and brutality, than it was a community of musicians. There were other hidden vices in the city besides alcohol and drugs. They were about a system that thrived on stifling anyone who dared to reveal the truth, power, and greed. Seeing so many lives destroyed by these shadows left Hank, who had fought his own battles, feeling incredibly disillusioned. He acknowledged near the end of his life that although Nashville was marketed to the world as a city of happiness and light, in fact, it was a place where corruption and temptation were ingrained in the very fabric of its prosperity. Despite his achievements, Hank Snow was always impacted by the darkness he spoke about. The public rarely saw the man struggling with burdens behind the singing ranger's polished stage persona. He carried the scars from his early years into adulthood, showing up as periods of sadness and mistrust that persisted even during his most illustrious years. As a Canadian who had pushed his way into Nashville's elite circle, and as a man who refused to play some of the games that the industry required, he frequently felt alone. He was admired for his success. However, it also brought pressure, and compromise was frequently the result of pressure in Nashville. Although Hank was cautious about his public persona, he was personally burdened by fatigue from numerous tours, restless nights, and the never-ending pressure to produce hit after hit. He was almost consumed by the same machine, he later revealed. There were times when the financial burden of contracts, legal actions, and commitments made him wonder if the career he had established was worth the costs. While fans witnessed a happy star in the spotlight, the loneliness of the road exacerbated those emotions. Innumerable nights were spent in motel rooms away from family, in quiet after the crowd's roar had subsided. Hank acknowledged that he had been tempted by the same vices that so many of his contemporaries were enamored with. There were always pills and alcohol nearby, offered without charge to ease the pains of touring, and to ease the emotional struggles associated with being famous. Hank, however, made a valiant effort to avoid being ingested whole. Where others failed, his determination kept him alive. He did not, however, forget the artists who were unable to attend. His conviction that Nashville's system was set up to take advantage of, not to support, was strengthened each time he saw another name lost to addiction, scandal, or despair. Stars were created by the industry, but they were rarely protected. Hank struggled not only with Nashville's outside influences, but also with himself. He frequently thought he was leading two lives: the public Hank Snow, a representation of the tradition of country music, and the private Hank Snow, a traumatized man, exhausted by betrayal, and in search of purpose beyond the cheers. Later in life, he admitted that there were moments when he felt stuck, as if he were still that young boy in Nova Scotia attempting to flee abuse. Only now were the walls of the prison constructed with agreements, duties, and anticipations. Sometimes, the music that had once saved his life felt like a chain that he would never be able to completely escape. Nevertheless, Hank found strength despite his difficulties. He persevered because he thought his story might serve as a warning to others. He came clean about Nashville's sinister realities as a survivor as well as a critic. He wanted his admirers to know that although his life appeared to be perfect on the surface, it was actually much more complicated, and every smile he made on stage was earned via years of unseen struggles. Although Hank Snow was aware that he couldn't reverse the harm Nashville had already done to so many artists, he made it his goal to keep others from making the same mistakes. He felt it was his responsibility to protect the weak, because he had been abused as a child and exploited in his work. He frequently talked about how he felt driven to speak up for people who were too scared to question the status quo. As Nashville tightened its hold on young performers in the 1950s and 1960s, Hank started to push for contracts that were honest and equitable. He advised artists to obtain appropriate legal counsel prior to signing any contracts. His own painful experience of witnessing how easily skill could be stolen by deceptive language and fine print served as a warning. He was more than just a vocalist. In a field that thrived on secrecy, he stood up for integrity. His assistance in founding groups to defend musicians' rights and provide them with assistance in fending off the predatory practices that had long afflicted Nashville is among his proudest accomplishments. Additionally, Hank mentored up-and-coming musicians, offering them both personal and musical guidance. He cautioned them of the unspoken perils of celebrity, the demands of the road, the temptations behind the scenes, and the merciless executives who grinned while honing their blades. He wanted them to realize that success had a price, and that preserving their honor was more significant than pursuing fleeting fame. However, he was frequently unpopular with those who profited from the status quo because of his advocacy. Hank acknowledged that he occasionally lost opportunities because of his willingness to speak out, and that he made enemies in high places by advocating for justice. Nevertheless, he agreed to that sacrifice because he thought that remaining silent would imply his support for the very system he hated. Hank believed that it was his duty, not just his choice, to safeguard the upcoming generation of country singers. And he stayed dedicated to using his voice to call attention to injustice, even in his later years, long after his days as a chart topper had ended. Although his actions did not completely eradicate Nashville's more sinister customs, they did so by sowing the seeds of resistance and inspiring artists to respect themselves and take charge of their own lives. It was evident that a large portion of Hank Snow's legacy had been molded by his desire to protect others. When he eventually came clean before his death, he had witnessed the brutality of exploitation firsthand. However, he would not allow others to suffer without cause. And that was a bigger win for him than a sold-out show or gold record. Unspoken truths became a greater burden on Hank Snow as he approached the end of his life. His health was deteriorating by the time he was 85, and he realized that his time was running out. At last, he spoke with an unvarnished honesty that he had long concealed. Hank exposed Nashville's darker side in interviews, private discussions, and even moments spent with close friends. He acknowledged that he had witnessed promising talents being sucked up by the system, spit out, and forgotten for decades. He acknowledged that, although fans witnessed the glitz and glamour of celebrity, he witnessed the sorrows, the crushed souls, and the corpses left behind by unbridled ambition. His words were intended to reveal Nashville, not to destroy it. To reveal the world what it really was by removing the pristine facade. A city supported by sacrifice but founded on dreams. Hank talked about young singers who came with hope and left years later, broken, addicted, or irreparably disillusioned. He discussed how executives took advantage of people's weaknesses, how artists' unending tour schedules destroyed their health and families, and how silence was required whenever scandals or abuses were revealed. The guilt that plagued him the most was his own admission that he had occasionally been complicit, ignoring the situation out of a need to survive. Hank's tone during his last confession was one of mourning rather than resentment. He didn't lose his temper. Rather, he spoke with regret that it had taken him so long to be completely honest, and with sadness for the lives lost. By telling the truth, he hoped to better prepare future generations, that admirers would view their heroes as people ensnared in a system that prioritized money over music, rather than as untouchable stars. Hank believed that the only way he could reconcile with himself before his death was to lift the curtain. His admission was more than just a reflection. It was a legacy, the last brave deed of a man who had kept secrets for too long. Hank Snow left behind more than just a collection of classic songs. When he died in 1999, he left behind a warning, an unvarnished look at Nashville's hidden machinery that few had the courage to reveal. He wasn't just an elderly man reflecting when he made his confession at 85, a truth that had been spoken by someone who had lived long enough to see behind the curtain and endure long enough to tell it. It was a reckoning. As the singing ranger and smooth-voiced star, who had led them on musical adventures with hits like I'm Moving On and I've Been Everywhere, fans lamented him. However, Hank's legacy went beyond music for those who paid close attention to his parting remarks. It had to do with being truthful. He made fans of country music face the fact that their favorite city, Nashville, was a graveyard for innumerable artists whose names never reached the marquee lights, as well as a dream factory. His tales of abuse, deceit, and coercion illuminated the costs associated with the songs that people loved. His admission was shocking to many. It was simply the truth, finally told out loud to others in the industry. Hank's disclosures permanently tainted Nashville's reputation as a conservative, family-friendly city. He did not, however, share his story in order to demolish the city or to discredit its myths. In order for fans to view their heroes as human beings who are fighting struggles that most people would never think to confront, rather than as untouchable idols, he told it so that future singers would enter the scene with their eyes open. As part of his lasting legend, Hank Snow was known for telling the truth. His cautions remained relevant in the years following his death, as other artists came forward with comparable tales, demonstrating that he had not been exaggerating, but had simply been the first to express what so many already knew. He was more than a star because of his bravery in breaking the silence. It gave him a voice that outlasted him and made him a protector. When fans think of Hank Snow today, they recall not just the music that shaped a time, but also the integrity of a man who, in his final years, refused to allow Nashville's darker side to go unnoticed. His legacy serves as a reminder that every song has a backstory, and sometimes those backstories are painful. But Hank gave meaning to those stories by speaking the truth, and made sure his voice would reverberate long after the last curtain had fallen.